In a world that grows noisier every day, there is a place made just for you. A place where sacred stories are told slowly, with love, to calm your mind and warm your soul. Here, you will hear stories with deep reflections to bring you peace, hope, and help strengthen your faith. You'll hear people just like you, people with fear, with struggles, but with the feeling that somehow everything's going to be okay. Because before sleep, what we need most is to relax the mind and soothe the heart, to enjoy a quiet night and a refreshing sleep under the care of God. So now, make yourself comfortable and enjoy tonight's story. And if, by the end, you feel just a little better, tell us in the comments where you're from and how you're feeling. We'd love to create more content to meet your heart's needs. Imagine losing everything. Home, plans, dreams, family, even hope. And still, choosing to keep walking. That's exactly what happened to Naomi. She was an ordinary woman, a wife, a mother. She lived in Bethlehem, yes, the same Bethlehem that would one day witness the birth of a Savior. But at that time, Bethlehem was dry. The earth cracked beneath their feet. Food was scarce, and hunger knocked like a cruel guest that refused to leave. Naomi and her husband, Elimelech, did what many would do. They left. They took their sons, packed what little they could, and went to the land of Moab. A strange place, with different gods, different customs, but food. And that alone was reason enough. For a while, it seemed things would work out. The sons grew up and married Moabite women, one named Ruth, the other Orpah. Life began to settle. It wasn't the dream, but it was a life. Then, like a storm without warning, everything began to collapse. First, Naomi lost her husband, then one of her sons, and then the other. And there she was, 3 women, widows, with no direction, as if fate had erased the canvas of her life and left only shadows. In Moab, she was a foreigner, with no husband, no sons, no inheritance. A woman invisible in a world that didn't forgive loneliness. One quiet morning, Naomi stood up. There was no reason to stay. Bethlehem was still far, but something inside her said it was time to return. Not because there was hope there, but because there was nothing left here. She looked at Ruth and Orpah with eyes full of memories and said, "Go back to your mother's homes. You still have lives to live. Go. Start again." It was a gentle goodbye, soaked in sorrow. And anyone who has tried to smile while their heart is falling apart knows how heavy that farewell was. Orpah cried, deeply. She kissed Naomi, hugged her tightly, and left. But Ruth stayed. She stood still, looking straight ahead, like someone hearing the whole world fall apart and deciding to remain standing. With a voice soft but firm as stone, she said, "Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die too, and there I will be buried." Naomi said nothing, because sometimes love speaks too loudly for words to answer. And so their journey began, a woman tired from sorrow, and another, guided by a love that made no sense, but felt like the only thing left. The road back to Bethlehem wasn't long, but it felt endless, not because of distance, but because of absence. Each step Naomi took was a memory. Each stone on the path seemed to whisper names that could no longer be called. And beside her, always steady, was Ruth. No complaints, no questions, just walking. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the town paused. The women whispered in corners, "Is that Naomi?" Could it really be her? But Naomi, her gaze distant and her face marked by time and grief, replied bluntly, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has made my life very bitter." She didn't want pity. She didn't want to be noticed as the one who returned. She just wanted to survive. And maybe, if possible, forget. But life doesn't wait for the heart to heal. It was barley harvest season. Bethlehem was no longer the dry land she had once left. The fields shimmered golden, the air smelled of bread, and workers moved with full baskets and full hearts. But Naomi had no land, no harvest, nothing. Then Ruth, with the softness of one who loves quietly, came close to Naomi and said, "Let me go into the fields. Maybe someone will be kind enough to let me gather the fallen grain." It was humble work, not a job, more like charity. The poor followed behind the harvesters, picking up what was left. But it was all they had. And sometimes, when everything is lost, the little becomes everything. Naomi nodded, and Ruth went. Alone into fields she didn't know, among people who saw her as a stranger, looking for scraps no one wanted. She lay at his feet, as Naomi had said, and waited. In the middle of the night, Boaz stirred. Startled, he sat up. "Who are you?" he whispered. Ruth's voice came soft, but full of courage. "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over me, for you are a redeemer." There was a pause, and then a smile, a warmth in his voice. "May the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown kindness again, not chasing after younger men, rich or poor. Do not fear. I will do all that you ask. Everyone in town knows you are a woman of noble character." But Boaz wasn't the only one who could redeem her. There was another, closer in line, and things had to be done properly. "Stay here tonight," Boaz said, "and in the morning I will speak to him. If he will redeem you, good. But if not, I will." Ruth laid there quietly, not as a woman begging for rescue, but as a woman finally being seen. Ruth returned home just before sunrise. She moved through the early mist with a bundle of grain in her arms and a quiet storm of thoughts in her chest. Boaz had given her more food before she left, not just as provision, but as a message, a promise wrapped in barley. When Naomi saw her, she didn't ask what happened, not right away. She just looked into Ruth's eyes and understood. Then Ruth told her everything. The words came gently, like petals falling, about the night, the threshing floor, Boaz's kindness, his promise to speak to the other man who could claim her. Naomi smiled with something deeper than hope, something closer to trust. "Wait, my daughter," she said, "until we see how this turns out. Boaz will not rest until this is settled today." And Naomi was right. That very morning, Boaz went straight to the town gate, the place where business was done, where elders gathered and agreements were made. He waited until the other potential redeemer passed by. "Come, sit here," Boaz said. The man came. 10 elders joined as witnesses. And Boaz explained everything, how Naomi had returned from Moab, how she was selling the land that belonged to her late husband, and how, as the closest relative, this man had the first right to buy it. The man nodded. "I'll redeem it." But Boaz wasn't done. "On the day you buy the land," he said, "you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite widow, to preserve the name of her late husband through his inheritance." The man paused. That changed everything. "I cannot redeem it," he said quickly. "It might endanger my own estate." And just like that, he stepped aside. Boaz took off his sandal, a customary act to seal the deal, and declared before all the elders, "You are witnesses today that I have acquired the land, and Ruth the Moabite as my wife." There was no celebration, no music or dancing, just nods of approval, murmurs of respect, and the weight of something sacred being restored. The elders blessed them. "May the Lord make this woman like Rachel and Leah," they said, "who together built the house of Israel. May your house be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." And somewhere in the background of that small gathering, the future shifted. Ruth had once been a foreigner gleaning leftovers in the field. Now, she was a bride, not because she chased favor, but because she walked with quiet strength and loved without condition. She didn't just find redemption. She became part of a lineage that would one day carry a king. The wedding wasn't written in songs or scrolls. There were no grand feasts recorded, no detailed ceremonies. But in the hearts of those who watched, it was more than enough. Boaz took Ruth as his wife, and when he did, something shifted not just in their lives, but in the very rhythm of Bethlehem. The woman who had arrived with nothing now stood as part of a new beginning, not just for herself, not just for Naomi, but for generations yet to come. In time, the Lord blessed them with a son. His name was Obed. And when Ruth held him for the first time, it was as if the years of sorrow melted into warmth. His tiny hands didn't just hold her fingers. They held every piece of hope she thought had been lost in Moab, every silent prayer, every night spent gathering barley under the sun, every morning waking beside grief and choosing to go on. She had not chased a dream. She had walked with love, and now that love had a heartbeat. But the one who smiled the widest was Naomi. She took the child in her arms, held him close, and the women of Bethlehem came around her, whispering in awe, "Naomi has a son." Not Ruth, Naomi. Because this wasn't just Ruth's redemption. It was Naomi's restoration. The woman who had once called herself Mara, bitterness, now held sweetness in her arms. Her lap, once empty, now cradled legacy. Her house, once silent, now echoed with a soft cry of new life. And Obed. He would grow. He would laugh and run and ask questions no one could answer. He would sit at Boaz's feet, learn the ways of kindness, hear stories of barley and brave love. And one day, he would have a son too. His name would be Jesse, and Jesse would father David. Yes, that David. The shepherd who would slay giants, the king who would dance before the Lord. The man after God's own heart. Ruth, the foreigner, the widow, the gleaner, had become part of a royal line. But she didn't know any of that. She only knew she loved, that she gave, that she stayed. And in doing so, she reminded the world of something we all forget, that the quietest acts of loyalty often echo the loudest through time. Time moved on, as it always does. Seasons came and went, harvests rose and fell, and little Obed grew stronger with each passing year. Ruth and Boaz built a life that wasn't marked by grandeur, but by something far rarer, peace. The kind of peace that comes after storms. The kind you don't take for granted because you remember the silence that came before it. Their home was modest, but filled with warmth. Boaz was the kind of father who showed rather than told. He taught Obed how to tie bundles of grain, how to listen before speaking, how to honor the Lord not with speeches, but with steady hands and honest work. Ruth, on the other hand, wrapped the boy in a kind of love that spoke from the soul. She knew what it meant to lose everything. And so she loved like someone who understood the value of every breath. And Naomi, Well, Naomi became the soft anchor in that house. She wasn't just a grandmother. She was the heartbeat of their mornings and the wisdom of their nights. She sang lullabies with a voice made strong by pain and redemption. Obed adored her, everyone did. But outside their walls, people still whispered about Ruth, not in cruelty, but in curiosity. Because even now, years later, she remained different. A Moabite in a land that once saw her people as outsiders. A woman whose story didn't follow the rules, yet seemed to be blessed beyond reason. How did she get here? Some would ask. And the answer couldn't be explained with logic. Because Ruth hadn't strategized her way into a future. She hadn't married Boaz for position or gain. She hadn't followed Naomi to earn favor with God. She simply loved. And that love, fierce, faithful, undeserved, had opened doors no title could. Sometimes people overcomplicate faith. They think it has to look a certain way, speak a certain language, follow a certain structure. But Ruth's life stood as a quiet rebellion against that. She was a foreigner, a widow, a woman without status. And yet, she was chosen, not just by Boaz, but by a divine plan that wove her name into eternity. Because what happened through Ruth wasn't just about barley or bloodlines. It was about a God who sees the unseen, honors the humble, and rewrites destinies through unexpected hands. Obed would one day learn all of this. He'd grow up hearing his mother's story not as a tragedy, but as a tapestry. He'd hear how she left everything behind for love, how she bent to pick up fallen grain, and was lifted into a lineage of kings. And maybe, just maybe, he'd grow up believing that greatness doesn't come from being first in line or loudest in the room, but from loving when you have no reason to. Years passed, and though Ruth's name rarely left her lips, Naomi watched her daughter-in-law with a quiet reverence. There was something unshakable about Ruth. Not just her strength. Many women were strong. It was her presence, the way she moved through life without asking the world to notice her, and yet the world always did. She didn't seek attention. She simply gave, and in giving, she was unforgettable. In the fields, she worked beside the harvesters as if she had never become the wife of a landowner. In the markets, she greeted the elders with the same respect she had shown as a stranger. In her home, she served her family with the kind of care that made every meal taste like memory. Obed grew under this quiet canopy of love and example. He didn't just learn how to be a man. He learned how to be kind, how to listen, how to notice when someone needed help, even if they never asked. That's what Ruth taught him, not through lessons, but through how she lived. And Boaz? Boaz loved Ruth more with every passing season. There were nights when he would sit beside her, staring at the fire, his hand resting gently on hers. He would look at her face, worn from work, soft from time, and still see the girl who lay at his feet on the threshing floor, brave and trembling, asking not for charity, but for redemption. He had been a man of honor before Ruth, but with her, he had become more patient, more open, more whole. Theirs was not a love made of fireworks and songs. It was built like the walls of a home, slow, steady, brick by brick, sheltering everything inside from the storms beyond. And while the world outside kept turning, kingdoms rising, empires falling, laws being written and rewritten, inside their home, a legacy was forming. Not in gold or scrolls or battles won, but in love passed down like a family heirloom. One day, Obed would speak to his own son, Jesse, of his childhood. He'd describe the scent of barley in the early mornings, the sound of his mother's voice, humming soft songs from a land she never saw again, the warmth of his grandmother's hands, wrapping bread in cloth, the strength of his father's arms when storms came. And in those memories, Jesse would grow. He would carry something deeper than tradition. He would carry a story rooted not in power, but in grace. And Jesse's son, David, he would rise from those roots. But before kings wore crowns, before battles were sung, before Goliath ever fell, there was a woman who stayed, who chose love over comfort, who chose faith over fear, who chose to follow and became the foundation of a royal line. Sometimes, the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary places, not on thrones, not in palaces, not in the courts of kings, but in fields, in kitchens, in silent acts of love between people no one is watching. That's where Ruth's legacy lived. And though her name would one day be written in sacred scrolls, placed alongside patriarchs and prophets, Ruth herself never sought to be remembered. She was too busy remembering others. She remembered Naomi when everyone else might have left. She remembered dignity, even when she had none to claim. She remembered that faith wasn't a feeling, it was a decision, a daily one, a quiet one. And for generations, that quiet decision would ripple. Obed would tell stories of her. Jesse would pass them down. And David, Israel's future king, would inherit not just land or lineage, but the spirit of a woman who refused to let sorrow harden her heart. In the Psalms, he would one day write, "You can almost feel it, that undercurrent of tenderness, that reverence for mercy, that soft core of the warrior poet who sang of God's nearness." Maybe that came from Ruth. Maybe that came from watching his father, Jesse, who watched Obed, who watched Ruth move through life like a prayer. And centuries later, when the world would grow dark again, when the prophets had fallen silent, when Rome had tightened its grip and hope flickered like a dying candle, another child would be born in Bethlehem. Not to a noble family, not in gold or silk, but to a young woman in a stable with straw beneath her feet. And in the records of his lineage, Ruth's name would appear. The Moabite, the outsider, the widow who became a mother in the line of the Messiah. It's easy to read past her name, to glance over it as just another branch in a family tree. But heaven does not forget love like hers. Heaven remembers every grain of barley she picked, every step she took beside Naomi, every word she spoke beneath the stars. Because sometimes, it's not the loudest stories that shape the world. It's the ones whispered through generations, the ones built on loyalty, courage, and gentle strength, the ones like Ruth's. And so it was that Ruth's story, though seemingly simple, held a depth that only time could reveal. There were no miracles that split seas, no thundering voices from the sky, no armies marching behind her. Her life unfolded in the quiet corners, in fields, in footsteps, in choices made with trembling faith. But isn't that where most of us live? Not in the spotlight, but in the everyday. Washing dishes, holding hands, choosing kindness when it would be easier not to. Staying when it would be easier to walk away. Loving people who might never say thank you. Ruth never asked for greatness. And maybe that's what made her great. She didn't see herself as a hero. She didn't plan to be part of history. She just followed love where it led. Even when it led through loss, through hunger, through the long walk back to Bethlehem with nothing but a grieving mother-in-law and a heart full of questions. And yet, in her quiet obedience, she changed the course of nations. That's the hidden power of stories like hers. They remind us that redemption doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it looks like gathering leftovers. Sometimes it feels like waiting in the dark for someone to wake and notice you at their feet. And sometimes it ends with a baby in your arms. Not just any baby. A child born not only to comfort your pain, but to carry forward a promise. A child whose name would be Obed, and who would father Jesse, and who would father David. And from David would come another child, many generations later, a child who would walk the earth with sand in his sandals and healing in his hands. A child born of a virgin, wrapped in cloth, laid in a manger under starlight. Jesus, the Messiah, the Redeemer, and tucked deep in his lineage, hidden between kings and warriors, is Ruth, the foreigner, the widow, the woman who chose love over fear, the woman who, without knowing it, became the great-grandmother of salvation. Not through strategy, not through strength, but through faith that kept walking. Even when the way forward wasn't clear. If you were to sit quietly beneath the stars above Bethlehem tonight and listen closely, not to the noise of the world, but to the hush beneath it, you might still hear her story. Not in words, but in rhythm. The rhythm of footsteps on dusty roads, the rustle of barley in a breeze, the sound of breath drawn in faith, not fear. Because Ruth's story was never about triumph in the way the world defines it. It wasn't about riches, revenge, or recognition. It was about staying present, staying kind, staying faithful. And in a world that so often celebrates the loudest voices, the biggest crowns, the fastest victories, her life whispered something different. That love is the seed of legacy. And when love is planted with humility, it grows into something eternal. Obed would one day tell his children that his mother was once a stranger, that she walked into a foreign land with no promise of welcome, that she carried more grief than grain in her hands, and that somehow, through all of it, she loved anyway. He would tell them how she treated his grandmother like a treasure, how she picked up scraps with grace, how she accepted kindness with humility, and how, when given the chance, she chose redemption without demand. Maybe he would say, "My mother didn't teach me through speeches. She taught me through silence, through work, through her presence." And one day David would hear those stories. Maybe it's what taught him to write psalms in caves. Maybe it's what taught him to dance even when people disapproved. Maybe it's what taught him that God sees not as man sees, not the appearance, but the heart. All of that from Ruth. It's easy to think our lives are too small to matter, that our kindness goes unnoticed, that our choices made in the quiet have no weight in a world that shouts. But Ruth shows us otherwise. She reminds us that the smallest acts, done with the greatest love, echo far beyond what we can see. That walking faithfully in obscurity can lead to unimaginable light. That sometimes the most important chapters in history are written in barley fields, not battlefields. So if tonight you feel unseen, remember her, because heaven never forgot. As the years passed, Ruth's name quietly found its way into the hearts of her people. Not through monuments, not through songs sung in the streets, but in the way people spoke about her, with warmth, with wonder, with reverence. Children in Bethlehem would whisper to one another, "That's the house where Ruth lives." And the mothers would smile, correcting gently, "No, that's the house where love lives." She had become a symbol without ever trying to be one. A symbol of courage that doesn't shout, of love that doesn't demand, of faith that doesn't always understand, but walks forward anyway. And in the quiet spaces of the village, in the marketplaces, in the olive groves, in the fields where she once gathered grain, her story began to take root, not as folklore, but as foundation. There was something unexplainable about her presence, a peace that followed her, a softness that disarmed even the hardest men. Some said it was the blessing of Boaz, others the wisdom of Naomi. But those who looked closer saw the truth. Ruth carried something holy, not robes, not titles, not sacred scrolls tucked under her arm. She carried a heart that had broken and healed and still opened again. She carried the kind of kindness that didn't need to be seen to be real. And in that small village, she quietly helped raise a boy who would become the father of a man who would change the shape of Israel. Not because she sought legacy, but because she lived faithfully in the shadows. There are people like that in every generation. You don't hear their names. They don't build empires. They build people. They restore dignity with a touch. They teach strength with a glance. They plant seeds with their lives that bloom long after they're gone. And when the world wonders how hope survived, it's because of them, because of people like Ruth. And so, though her life may seem small by some standards, just a story tucked deep into the pages of an ancient book, it is, in truth, one of the great pillars of redemption. Because without her, there is no Obed, no Jesse, no David, no Bethlehem miracle under a star. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful kind of story. One that doesn't end with applause, but with a legacy that still breathes in the quiet. In the later years of Ruth's life, the world outside her home changed in ways she could never have predicted. New families arrived in Bethlehem. New crops were planted. Young couples were married beneath cloth canopies. The sound of children laughing in the streets grew louder each season. And life, as it always does, kept moving. But inside her home, time had a different rhythm. It moved slower, softer. Ruth no longer spent her days gathering barley or kneading dough with tired hands. Instead, she sat near the windows, watching the light shift across the walls, listening to Obed's voice in the courtyard, deep and warm, teaching his own sons the same gentle truths she once lived. Sometimes she would smile without knowing it. Sometimes she would close her eyes and remember. The dusty roads of Moab, Naomi's silent tears, the first time she saw Boaz watching her in the field, the firelight on the night she lay at his feet, heart pounding. All of it felt like both yesterday and 100 lifetimes ago. She never spoke much about her pain, not because it wasn't there, but because it no longer ruled her. It had been transformed, folded into the layers of her life like an old thread in a strong tapestry, visible only if you knew where to look. And Naomi? She had grown old too, her hair silver, her voice softer, but her spirit still fierce, still wise. The two women would sit together some days without saying much. They didn't need to. Their bond had been forged in fire and famine, in burial and barley. Words couldn't improve what silence had already perfected. Sometimes, Obed's children would crawl into Ruth's lap, asking questions. "Is it true you came from far away? Were you scared? "Did Grandpa Boaz really fall in love with you in a field?" And Ruth would laugh, a quiet, almost surprised laugh, like someone still amazed by how the story turned out. "Yes," she would say, to all of it, because it was all true. And yet, it was more than true. It was sacred. It was proof that even the smallest acts of love, a touch, a step, a whisper in the dark, can echo far beyond what any of us will ever see. And Ruth? She didn't just live a good life. She passed one on. There was a day, not marked by any festival or special gathering, when Ruth simply didn't rise with the morning. The house was quiet, but not in grief, in reverence. Obed entered her room, as he often did, bringing warm tea and soft bread. But that morning, the bed was still, the blanket undisturbed except for the gentle shape beneath it. Ruth had passed in her sleep. No struggle, no pain, just a breath that did not return. Naomi sat beside her for a long while, her weathered hands resting on Ruth's motionless fingers. She didn't cry, not at first. Some love is too deep for tears. She whispered something no one else heard, a final goodbye wrapped in gratitude only she could give. The village gathered slowly. Word spread like sunlight, quietly, evenly, illuminating hearts more than streets. "She's gone," they said. And then, after a pause, "She lived well." The women of Bethlehem washed her body with care. They dressed her in clean linen, combed her hair gently, and placed a single stalk of barley in her hands. Not because it was tradition, but because it was truth. That was Ruth, the one who bent low in the fields and rose high in the hearts of a people not her own. Obed stood tall at her burial. His eyes were steady, though his heart ached. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence, his life, the family he'd built, it all testified to the woman who had raised him. Naomi, older than anyone had expected her to live, leaned on him for support. But in that moment, she seemed ageless, as if saying farewell to Ruth was not the end, but the fulfillment of something long written in heaven. There were no kings at Ruth's funeral, no royal banners, no long processions, no music, except the wind weaving gently through the barley fields just beyond the town. But her story didn't end there. It was whispered in lullabies, taught in quiet corners, passed from mother to child, from elder to youth. It became part of Bethlehem's breath and part of Israel's blood. And long after Obed was gone, and Jesse, and David himself, Ruth's name remained, because it wasn't carved in stone. It was carved in love, and love, real love, never dies. In the centuries that followed Ruth's death, empires would rise and fall. The streets of Bethlehem would change. New walls built, old ones crumbled. Different rulers would govern. Different languages would echo through the market stalls. Coins would change hands. Flags would change colors. But Ruth's story stayed. It lived not in monuments, but in the marrow of the people. Fathers told it to their sons at dusk. Mothers whispered it to their daughters while braiding their hair. Elders shared it with travelers, not as myth or legend, but as something personal, as something real. Because Ruth had not been larger than life. She had been life itself, raw, faithful, resilient. And in the synagogue scrolls, when genealogies were read, long lists of names, many forgotten to time, hers was always there, always steady. Salmon, the father of Boaz. Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of David. It didn't matter that she was a Moabite. It didn't matter that she came from across the border. It didn't matter that her beginning was filled with loss. What mattered was how she loved. The people remembered because her love had changed things. It had changed Naomi. It had changed Boaz. It had changed the line of kings. And though generations passed and new stories took center stage, of battles won, giants slain, kingdoms forged, the story of Ruth remained quietly at the roots of it all. And when, one night, centuries later, a young couple came to Bethlehem, a man named Joseph, a woman named Mary, and when they couldn't find a place to stay, and when she gave birth in the silence of a stable, and when she laid the newborn in a manger under a sky no one could stop staring at, it happened there, in that place, that town, the town Ruth had chosen when she chose Naomi, the town she had walked into with nothing, the town where she had gathered barley, fallen in love, raised a son, and been buried in peace. That town, Ruth's town, had become the birthplace of redemption, because long before Mary said yes to God, Ruth did too. That quiet, yes, it's easy to overlook it. Ruth didn't stand before angels. She didn't hear voices from burning bushes or see seas split in two. She didn't part crowds or lead armies. She simply chose to follow, to stay, to love. And that's what made her holy. Because sometimes the most sacred word you'll ever say to God isn't shouted from a mountaintop. It's whispered on the road, with dust in your sandals and grief in your chest. Yes, I'll go with her. Yes, I'll gather the fallen grain. Yes, I'll trust this stranger named Boaz. Yes, I'll believe there's still something ahead, even when everything behind me has vanished. And heaven, all of heaven, leaned in when she said it. You see, God doesn't only move through spectacle. He moves through the widow who wakes up and chooses kindness. Through the outsider who doesn't try to fit in, but shows up anyway. Through the foreigner who carries love into unfamiliar places. Through women like Ruth. Women who don't need recognition because they're too busy rebuilding what's been broken. Women who don't wait for signs because they've already chosen faith. Women who hold history in their arms and rock it gently to sleep. Ruth never knew she'd be part of something so grand. She never saw the temple rise. She never heard the psalm sung in her great-grandson's voice. She never met the baby born in a stable whose hands would one day heal the world. But none of it would have happened without her. Without her journey, without her barley, without her courage, without her yes. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of story the world needs more of. Not stories of people trying to be remembered, but stories of people who simply choose love. And let that be enough. Ruth's name appears only a handful of times in Scripture. A whisper, really, in a book filled with shouts. And yet, her presence lingers far beyond those few verses. Like the scent of bread long after it's been eaten. Like the warmth of a fire after the embers have cooled. Because the story wasn't just about her. It was about all of us. Anyone who's ever lost more than they could hold. Anyone who's ever followed love into uncertainty. Anyone who's ever walked into a place where they didn't belong and chose to stay anyway. Ruth reminds us that we are not forgotten, not when we feel alone, not when the journey is hard, not when all we have are empty hands and silent prayers. She reminds us that every act of love, no matter how small, becomes part of something eternal. A loaf shared with a grieving mother, a field crossed in the heat of day, a cloak laid over cold feet, a child held with arms that once buried their own. She never set out to be remembered. She set out to love. And that love became the bloodline of a savior. Sometimes, people say they want to change the world. But Ruth didn't change the world by force. She changed it by staying, by serving, by choosing one person, and loving them all the way through the pain. No spotlight, no platform, just barley in her hands and grace in her bones. And when we feel unseen, buried beneath the weight of life's routines, unheard in a noisy world, we can remember her, because heaven sees what others overlook, and heaven never overlooks love. If you had met Ruth in person, not the legend, not the name etched in holy texts, but the woman, you might not have recognized her greatness at first. She wouldn't have been the loudest voice in the room. She wouldn't have carried herself like someone important. You'd probably pass her on a quiet road and never guess she was a cornerstone of history. But if you looked closer, you'd see it in the way she listened, the way she held space for others, the way her hands never stopped moving, gathering, giving, comforting. You'd feel it in the calm that followed her, like the hush of a field after the harvest. And maybe, just maybe, she'd smile at you with tired eyes and a heart wide open, and say something so simple, so ordinary, you wouldn't realize it was sacred until much later. Because Ruth didn't need to prove her worth, she just lived it. She let her loyalty speak. She let her silence speak. She let her love speak. And that's why her story still echoes. She is proof that your name doesn't have to be famous to be eternal. That your kindness, unnoticed by the world, is still noticed by the one who made the stars. That your faith, even if no one else understands it, moves mountains in places you can't yet see. And one day, when the world was desperate for light, that light was born in Bethlehem. And though people gathered to see the newborn child, though wise men came with gold, shepherds knelt in awe, though angels sang over a manger, somewhere in heaven, a gentle story was being remembered. A story of a woman who said yes to love, a woman who walked behind harvesters with empty hands and gave the world a lineage that would hold redemption itself. Her name was Ruth, and everything changed because she stayed. As the story of Ruth continues to ripple through time, it becomes more than just a tale from the past. It becomes a mirror, a soft reflection of what is possible when we live not for recognition, but for meaning, not for applause, but for love. You might not find yourself in a field of barley. You might not be following a widowed mother-in-law into a foreign land. But you will face moments where you must choose between comfort and courage, between staying or leaving, between fear and faith. And when you do, Ruth's quiet echo will still be there, waiting in the wind. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. It's not just a vow from daughter-in-law to mother-in-law. It's a life posture. It's the soul whisper of someone who decides that loyalty is more powerful than logic, and that love is worth the risk. We live in a world that tells us to chase more success, more control, more validation. But Ruth chased less. She let go of her homeland, let go of her gods, let go of her old identity. And in the surrender, she found everything. Not overnight, not all at once, but piece by piece, in every field, every favor, every bowl of grain, every child's laugh, every quiet sunrise where she woke up and simply kept going. That's the kind of strength that doesn't make headlines, but it holds up entire generations. So if tonight you feel small, if your life feels like a quiet whisper no one hears, If you're walking through loss, or loving someone in silence, or doing the next right thing with no applause, you are not forgotten. Your story still matters. Because love, like Ruth's, never disappears. It weaves its way into the fabric of everything good, even when you can't see the pattern yet. And maybe that's the beauty of Ruth's story. It doesn't end with the grand finale. It ends with life, real life. The kind with slow mornings and warm bread and children's footsteps echoing down clay floors. No armies marched in her name. No prophets declared her future. She wasn't crowned or exalted in her lifetime. But she became the foundation of something greater than any earthly throne. Ruth teaches us that legacy isn't built in a moment. It's built in the moments between, in every small choice made with love. She could have stayed in Moab. She could have remarried quickly. She could have mourned in private and moved on. But she didn't. She chose a bitter, grieving woman and said, "You won't walk alone." She chose long days in foreign fields. She chose humility when pride would have been easier. She chose to serve without being seen. And the heavens, quiet and watching, took note. Because God has always worked through stories like hers, the overlooked, the underestimated, the ones who carry grace in their hands instead of swords. And in Ruth's wake, the path was cleared for a child in a manger, for fishermen who left their nets, for a woman who would touch the hem of a robe and be healed, for sinners who would become saints, for love that would stretch across time and space and hang on a cross. All of it, somehow, flows through her, through the footsteps of a foreign widow who walked into Bethlehem with empty hands and a heart full of faith. So tonight, as you lie in bed, listening to the hush of the world winding down, let her story settle over you like a blanket. Let it remind you that your faith matters, your love matters, your presence, your staying matters. Even if no one claps, even if no one sees, heaven sees. And heaven never forgets a heart like Ruth's. And maybe, just maybe, that's what we're really searching for in the quiet hours before sleep. Not answers, not victories, not even clarity, but connection. A reminder that our lives, however ordinary they may seem, are part of something eternal. That our pain isn't wasted. That our waiting isn't in vain. That our quiet sacrifices ripple across generations in ways we'll never fully understand. Ruth never saw the full picture. She never saw David crowned. She never read the Psalms. She never heard the name Jesus. She simply lived with integrity in each moment. And that was enough. The world would eventually catch up to her story. The scribes would record her name. The scrolls would preserve her journey. And one day, long after her bones returned to the earth, a star would rise over the same town she once walked into, carrying nothing but sorrow and love. A town that became holy ground, because Ruth had walked it. Sometimes we think holiness is something far away, found in temples, rituals, or people with perfect prayers. But Ruth's life tells another story. Holiness lives in barley fields, in shared meals, in grief that learns how to hold hope again, in footsteps that refuse to abandon love. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to be fearless or flawless or endlessly strong. You just have to stay and love and believe that it matters, because it does. It always has, and it always will. Ruth never saw herself as a builder of empire. She never stood on a platform or held a scroll. She never gave speeches, never led armies, never sat in judgment over a nation. And yet, She helped build the lineage of a kingdom. She helped shape the heart of a shepherd who would become a king. She helped carry a legacy that would stretch all the way to the edge of eternity, where grace would one day put on flesh. And it all started with a yes, with a choice to follow a grieving woman on a dusty road, with a choice to kneel in fields she didn't own, with a choice to trust the goodness of a God she had only heard about, but never yet seen. And isn't that the very definition of faith? Believing before the evidence arrives, choosing before the guarantee, loving before the reward. Ruth's story wasn't marked by lightning bolts or thrones. It was marked by consistency, by the way she stayed, by the way she gave, by the way she refused to let sorrow steal her softness. She held on to gentleness when the world gave her every excuse to harden. And that may be the greatest miracle of all. Because gentleness, true gentleness, is not weakness. It is the quiet strength that keeps hope alive in the harshest soil. It is the thread that holds families together, the whisper that carries through centuries, the reason redemption is even possible. So as the night deepens, as your breath slows and your thoughts settle, let Ruth's story be a lullaby for your soul, not one that puts you to sleep with forgetfulness, but one that reminds you, even in your smallest moments, that you are part of something divine. There's something sacred about the way Ruth lived her life. She didn't rush. She didn't strive. She didn't try to force her story into being something louder or bigger than it was. She simply walked her path, step by quiet step. She loved the people in front of her. She honored the pain she carried without letting it define her. She trusted a future she could not see, and in doing so, she rewrote the script that loss tried to hand her. She proved that even in the ashes, new life could bloom. She taught us that loyalty isn't something you say, it's something you live. And maybe the most powerful thing Ruth ever did wasn't leaving Moab, or gleaning barley, or even marrying Boaz. Maybe the most powerful thing she ever did was stay kind. Stay kind in the face of grief. Stay kind in the face of poverty. Stay kind in the face of uncertainty. Stay kind in a culture that didn't fully welcome her. And kindness, real, lasting, grounded in God kindness, is not ordinary. It's revolutionary. It's what makes strangers into family. It's what softens hardened hearts. It's what builds bridges across centuries, across bloodlines, across heavens and earth. When Ruth held Obed for the first time, she couldn't have known what he would become. She couldn't have known that David, the boy who would become Israel's greatest king, would rise from her line. She couldn't have known that one day angels would fill the sky above Bethlehem, proclaiming peace on earth, because of a child who would trace his lineage back to her. But she didn't need to know, because her faith was never based on outcomes. It was based on love. The truth is, Ruth's story never really ended. It lives on, not just in the pages of Scripture, but in every life touched by grace, in every quiet act of love that no one else sees, in every decision to stay, when walking away would be easier. She reminds us that you don't need a crown to shape a kingdom, that you don't need a voice in the crowd to change the future, that sometimes it's the one who kneels in silence, who stands tallest in the eyes of heaven. And maybe, in the most mysterious way, we're all part of her legacy. Every time we choose mercy over judgment, every time we serve without needing credit, every time we carry someone else's burden even when our own arms are tired, We're echoing her story. We're walking the same path she walked, the narrow, sacred one that leads through humility and into history. And when we find ourselves at a crossroads, confused, grieving, uncertain of what's ahead, Ruth's voice still reaches across the ages with that quiet, earth-shifting declaration. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. It's not just a vow. It's a blueprint for a life well lived, one rooted in presence, in patience, in unwavering love. So when the noise of the world fades, and you lie there with only your thoughts, let this truth settle over you. You don't have to change the world to matter. You just have to love well, like Ruth did. And now, as this story draws to a close, maybe the most powerful thing to remember is this. Ruth never knew how important she was. She never saw the scrolls, never heard the sermons, never watched the stars align over her town. She simply lived, faithfully, softly, bravely. And that was enough. She didn't wait to be certain before choosing love. She didn't demand clarity before offering her loyalty. She didn't need applause to keep doing what was right. She just stayed. Stayed when it was hard. Stayed when it was lonely. Stayed when nothing made sense. And in staying, she became the kind of story that doesn't just get told, it gets felt. Because Ruth reminds us that our most ordinary moments might be the very ones heaven uses to shape eternity. The kindness you give today, the forgiveness you offer quietly, the burden you carry for someone else. These things may not make headlines, but they are not forgotten. God sees, and He weaves every unseen act into a greater story, one more beautiful than we could ever imagine. So tonight, as your eyes begin to close, let Ruth's story rest gently on your heart. Let it remind you that love is never wasted, that faith is never ignored, that you, just as you are, wherever you are already part of something sacred. And maybe that's exactly where redemption begins, in the quiet, with someone who stays, just like Ruth.